The rain had been hammering Brooklyn for 3 hours straight, the kind of relentless October downpour that turned gutters into rivers and soaked through even the thickest jacket. Inside Rosie's diner, Enza Costa stood at the window, watching her own ghostly reflection superimposed against the wet pavement outside. The neon sign above flickered erratically, casting alternating shades of warm gold and cool blue across the nearly deserted street. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's go back to hours before where it all started. Enza, sweetheart, you getting out of here? Rosie's gravelly voice cut through the quiet hum of the empty diner. The 73-year-old owner was wiping down the counter with the same threadbare yellow rag she'd been using since Enza started working here 4 years ago. Enza checked the clock mounted above the kitchen pass-through. 11:02 p.m. Yeah, just need to grab those trash bags by the back door. Leave him, Rosie said, waving her off with one weathered hand. You've been on your feet since noon. That's an 11-hour shift, kid. Enza managed a tired smile. It's fine, Rosie. 2 minutes. Always got to be the responsible one, Rosie muttered, but her tone held warmth. At least take your umbrella this time. Enza pulled her faded canvas jacket from the hook near the kitchen and eyed the 2 bulging trash bags waiting by the door. Her umbrella sat on the shelf, right where she'd left it that morning. She picked it up, then set it back down. The dumpster was maybe 20 feet away. She'd survived worse. The fluorescent lights in the kitchen buzzed and flickered as she shouldered through the back door into the alley. The rain hit her immediately, cold, insistent, soaking through her jacket within seconds. Enza hefted both bags and moved quickly toward the dumpster at the far end of the narrow passage between the diner and the abandoned textile factory next door. Brooklyn at night had its own particular rhythm. Distant sirens, the low hum of traffic from the expressway, the occasional shout from a few blocks over. Enza had lived here all 26 years of her life. She knew which streets to avoid after dark, which shortcuts to take, how to keep her head down and her keys threaded between her fingers just in case. She tossed the first bag into the dumpster. The metallic clang echoed off the brick walls, then was swallowed by the rain. As she lifted the second bag, a sound stopped her cold. Crying. Not just any crying, the desperate, hiccuping wail of an infant. Enza's heart seized. She dropped the trash bag, its contents spilling forgotten onto the wet asphalt. The sound was coming from behind the larger dumpster, deeper in the shadows where the alley dead-ended against a chain-link fence. Hello. Her voice came out uncertain, barely audible over the rain. Is someone there? The crying intensified. No, not one voice. 2 distinct cries. 2 babies. Enza's feet moved before her brain fully processed what she was doing. She rounded the dumpster, her eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The narrow beam of the security light from the diner's back door barely reached this far into the alley. Then she saw them. 2 infant car seats sat on the rain-slicked pavement, partially sheltered by the metal fire escape above. The babies inside, they couldn't have been more than a few months old, were crying, their tiny faces red and scrunched with distress, their small fists waving helplessly. But it was the man slumped beside them that made Enza's breath catch in her throat. He was leaning heavily against the brick wall, one tattooed hand gripping the handle of the nearest car's seat with white-knuckled desperation. Even in the dim light, Enza could see the dark stain spreading across the left side of his chest, mixing with the rain that had plastered his thick dark hair to his forehead. His gray suit jacket was torn and soaked through, the burgundy shirt beneath it nearly black with blood. Oh my God, Enza breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. The cold water from the puddles soaked through her jeans instantly, but she barely registered it. Sir, can you hear me? The man's eyes fluttered open, dark brown, almost black in the shadows, filled with pain and something else. Fear. Not fear for himself, Enza realized with a jolt, but for the crying infants beside him. Please. His voice was barely above a whisper, heavily accented. Italian, definitely Italian. Please, no hospital. They'll find. His head lolled to the side, consciousness slipping. Enza's hands shook as she pressed them against his shoulder, feeling the warm wetness seep between her fingers. She'd seen injuries before. 2 years of medical school before she dropped out had taught her enough to recognize this was serious. A gunshot wound. She was almost certain. Still bleeding, though not as heavily as it must have been initially. But his skin was cold, too cold, and his breathing was shallow and uneven. "I need to call 911, Enza said, more to herself than to him. She fumbled for her phone with blood-slicked fingers. "No." His hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. His eyes locked on hers with fierce, desperate intensity. "No police. No hospital. They'll take the children." The children. Enza's gaze darted to the 2 car seats, to the babies whose cries had become weaker, more plaintive. They were soaked despite the partial shelter of the fire escape, their tiny blankets clinging to them. How long had they been out here in the cold? "You need a doctor," Enza insisted, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're bleeding. You could die. Better dead than." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent ice through Enza's veins. "Better than them found. Please, I'm begging you." Something in his eyes, in the raw desperation of his plea, cut through every rational thought screaming at her to call for help. This wasn't just fear. This was a parent's terror, the kind that transcended logic and self-preservation. And suddenly, Enza was 17 again, standing in a different hospital, watching her younger brother's chest rise and fall mechanically while machines beeped their monotonous rhythm. She remembered the helplessness, the fury at arriving too late, at not being there when Marco needed her most. The doctors had said he'd been calling for her. She'd been at a party, her phone on silent. She'd failed him once. She wouldn't fail again. "Okay," Enza heard herself say, though her mind screamed that this was insane. "Okay, no hospital, but I need to get you somewhere safe. Can you walk?" Relief flooded his features before pain twisted them again. "I'll try." Enza grabbed the nearest car seat, checking the baby inside. A little girl with wisps of dark hair, her face red from crying. The second seat held an identical infant, another girl. Twins. Her heart clenched. She secured both carriers together with shaking hands, looping her arm through both handles. "Come on," she said, positioning herself under the man's right arm, away from his injury. "My truck's parked on the street. It's not far. It might as well have been miles." The man was solid muscle beneath his expensive, ruined suit. Even wounded and weakened, he had to weigh at least 200 pounds. Enza gritted her teeth as she hauled him to his feet, her legs trembling under the sudden weight. He groaned, a sound of pure agony that made her own chest tighten. "I've got you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Just hold on." They moved in agonizing increments. 3 steps forward, then a pause while he gasped for breath, and she adjusted her grip. The babies had quieted to whimpers, perhaps exhausted from crying. Rain pounded down on them relentlessly, turning the alley into a gauntlet of slick pavement and treacherous shadows. Enza's truck, a battered Ford Ranger she'd bought third-hand 5 years ago, sat under a broken streetlight half a block from the diner. It had never looked so far away. "Keep moving," she urged as his steps faltered. "We're almost there." Halfway down the alley, his knees buckled. Enza caught him with a strength she didn't know she possessed, born of pure adrenaline and stubborn will. His head dropped against her shoulder, his breath hot against her rain-soaked neck. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice sharper now. "You don't get to die in this alley. You hear me? Those babies need you." Something in her words penetrated. His arm tightened around her shoulders, his jaw clenched, and he forced himself forward again. When they finally emerged onto the sidewalk, Enza's arms were screaming, her back on fire from supporting his weight. She fumbled for her keys with one hand while keeping him upright, nearly dropping them twice before finally getting the passenger door open. Getting him into the truck was a nightmare of awkward angles and suppressed cries of pain. Enza practically shoved him into the seat, his head lolling back against the headrest. His face had gone gray, lips tinged with blue. The twins came next. Enza secured both car seats in the back, her fingers clumsy with urgency as she clicked the seat belts into place. The baby stared up at her with dark, solemn eyes, too quiet now. Shock, maybe or exhaustion. Either way, it terrified her. She slammed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb before her rational mind could catch up and stop her. In the rearview mirror, Rosie's diner receded into the rainy night, its neon sign still flickering. Where? The man rasped beside her. Enza's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Her apartment in Queens. Small, anonymous, in a building where neighbors minded their own business. It was the only place she could think of. The only place where she might have a chance of doing what she'd promised. Somewhere safe, she said, taking a turn toward the expressway. Just stay conscious, okay? Tell me your name. There was a long pause. For a moment, she thought he'd passed out. Then, barely audible over the rain pounding on the windshield, he spoke. Federico. Federico, she repeated, tasting the name. I'm Enza, and I'm going to help you. But you have to fight. For them. She jerked her head toward the back seat. His eyes, when they met hers in the dim glow of passing streetlights, held something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition, as if he saw in her something she didn't see in herself. I'll fight, he whispered. Enza pressed harder on the gas, her old truck rattling as it picked up speed. She'd crossed a line tonight, stepped over a threshold she could never uncross. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from this impossible, reckless choice, there was no going back. The city blurred past in streaks of light and shadow. Behind her, two babies who should have been safe at home slept fitfully in their carriers. Beside her, a wounded stranger fought to stay conscious. And Enza Costa, the responsible waitress who always kept her head down, who'd spent 4 years playing it safe after her world fell apart, drove through the rain toward an uncertain future. She thought of Marco one last time, of the guilt that had haunted her for 9 years. Maybe she couldn't save her brother, but tonight, in a rain-soaked Brooklyn alley, she'd been given a second chance. She wasn't going to waste it. Enza's apartment building sat on a quiet street in Astoria, wedged between a Korean grocery store and a laundromat that had been closed for months. The building itself was unremarkable, a 5-story walk-up with faded brick and a front door that never quite locked properly. It was exactly the kind of place where people kept to themselves, asked no questions, and pretended not to notice when their neighbors came home at odd hours. Tonight, that anonymity felt like salvation. Enza pulled into the narrow alley behind the building, killing the engine and headlights in one motion. The rain had finally begun to ease, reduced to a steady drizzle that misted the windshield. She sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, reality crashing down on her in waves. She had a wounded stranger in her truck, 2 infants in the back seat, and absolutely no idea what she was doing. Federico. She turned to find him barely conscious, his head tilted against the window. We're here. Can you walk? His eyes opened to slits. Have to. Getting him up 3 flights of stairs was somehow worse than getting him to the truck. Enza looped his arm over her shoulders again, feeling his full weight settle against her as they staggered through the back entrance. The stairwell smelled of old cooking oil and mildew. Each step felt like climbing a mountain. Federico's breathing grew more labored with every floor. By the time they reached the 3rd landing, Enza was half dragging him, her own breath coming in gasps. She fumbled with her keys at apartment 3C, nearly dropping them twice before the lock finally gave. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Small, tidy, sparse. A studio with a kitchenette along one wall, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, and a single window that looked out onto the brick wall of the building next door. Not much, but it was hers, and right now was the only safe place she had. Enza guided Federico to her bed, the only real piece of furniture besides a rickety table and 2 chairs. He collapsed onto it with a groan, his blood immediately seeping into her faded blue comforter. Stay here, she said unnecessarily. I need to get the babies. The twins were still asleep, mercifully, when she carried their car seats up the stairs in 2 trips. Her arms shook with exhaustion by the time she set the second carrier down inside her apartment and locked the door behind her. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the impossible scene before her. Then training she'd thought long forgotten kicked in. Enza stripped off her soaked jacket and rolled up her sleeves. First things first, she grabbed every clean towel she owned from the bathroom, then filled a large pot with water and set it to boil on the stove. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she pulled out her ancient first aid kit from under the sink, the one she'd assembled in medical school and never quite thrown away. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. She tore through her apartment, gathering supplies. Rubbing alcohol, a bottle of vodka she'd been given as a Christmas gift 2 years ago, a sewing kit, clean dish towels, a pair of scissors. It was pitiful, makeshift, nothing like a proper surgical suite. But it would have to do. "Federico," she said, moving back to the bed. "I need to see the wound. Can you sit up?" He managed to push himself upright, though the effort left him gray-faced and sweating. Enza helped him out of his ruined suit jacket, then carefully peeled away the sodden burgundy shirt beneath. The fabric stuck to his skin, glued there by blood. When she finally got the shirt off, she had to suppress a gasp. The gunshot wound was in his left shoulder, just below the collarbone. The entry wound was clean enough, but when she helped him turn slightly, she saw the exit wound in his back. Larger, ragged, still seeping blood. Through and through. That was good, she told herself. No bullet to dig out. But the damage was extensive, and God only knew what it had torn through on its way out. Her gaze snagged on his right arm. An intricate tattoo sleeve covered him from shoulder to wrist, black ink forming elaborate patterns. Italian Renaissance imagery, she thought. Angels and demons, ornate scrollwork, and what looked like a family crest near his shoulder. Beautiful and expensive work. The kind of art that spoke of money and heritage and things Enza didn't want to think about right now. "This is going to hurt," she warned, reaching for the bottle of vodka. Federico's jaw clenched. "Do it." Enza poured the alcohol over the wound. Federico's entire body went rigid, a sound like a wounded animal torn from his throat, but he didn't pull away. She worked quickly, cleaning the entry and exit wounds, her hands steadier than she'd expected. 2 years of medical school. It wasn't enough, not really, but it was all she had. The hardest part was the stitches. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle, the fine sewing thread looking absurdly delicate for the task ahead. She'd sutured exactly 3 times in her life, all on training dummies in a sterile classroom. This was different. This was real flesh, real blood, a real man biting down on a rolled-up dish towel to keep from screaming. "I'm sorry," she whispered, making the first stitch. It took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of careful, agonizing work while Federico trembled and sweated and somehow, impossibly, stayed conscious. Enza stitched the exit wound first, her fingers cramping, then the entry wound. They weren't pretty, her stitches. They weren't even particularly good. But they held, and the bleeding finally slowed to a seep. She bandaged him with strips torn from clean sheets, wrapping his shoulder and chest until he looked like something from a war movie. Only when she tied off the last bandage did she realize she was crying, silent tears tracking down her face. "Done," she managed. "You're done." Federico's hand found hers, his grip weak but intentional. "Thank you." Enza pulled away, suddenly needing distance. She turned her attention to the twins, who had begun to fuss in their carriers. They needed to be changed, fed, warmed. She had no diapers, no formula, nothing for babies. "What do they need?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Federico's eyes were already closing. "Briefcase," he murmured. "Everything in the briefcase." "Briefcase." Enza looked around and spotted it for the first time, a sleek black leather case she must have brought up with the second car seat without really registering it. She pulled it onto the table and opened it. Her breath caught. Money. Stacks and stacks of cash, mostly hundreds, neatly banded. Thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. Beneath the money, she found a gun, heavy and black and terrifying. And tucked into the side pockets, bottles of formula diapers in tiny newborn sizes, pacifiers still in their packaging, and 2 changes of baby clothes. Enza stared at the contents, her stomach turning over. The money, the gun, the expensive tattoos, and the tailored suit, and the way he'd said, they'll find the children with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what they'd do once they found them. She'd brought a criminal into her home. Not just any criminal. Someone powerful, someone dangerous, someone being hunted by people dangerous enough to shoot him and threaten innocent babies. Behind her, Federico's breathing had evened out into the deep rhythm of unconscious exhaustion. In their carriers, both twins had begun to cry in earnest, their small voices rising in tandem. Enza closed the briefcase with shaking hands. She couldn't think about this now. Couldn't process what she'd done or what it meant. Right now, 2 babies needed her, and a wounded man was bleeding in her bed, and the night was far from over. She lifted the first baby from her carrier, a tiny warm weight that fit against her chest like she was made to hold her. The infant's dark eyes locked onto hers, wide and solemn and somehow trusting. "It's okay," Enza whispered, though she had no idea if that was true. "I've got you now. I've got you both." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city quiet and still. Inside apartment 3C, Enza Costa began learning how to care for twins while a stranger's blood dried on her hands and a gun sat on her kitchen table. There was no going back now. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched like years. Enza sat in one of her mismatched kitchen chairs, positioned between the bed where Federico lay unconscious and the makeshift nursery she'd created on the floor using couch cushions and every soft blanket she owned. The twins slept fitfully, waking every 2 hours like clockwork to cry for bottles she had to fumble to prepare, reading the formula instructions by the dim light of her phone. She'd never held a baby before tonight. Now she'd fed 2 of them, changed their impossibly tiny diapers, learned the difference between their cries. The one on the left, she'd started thinking of her as baby A, had a lower-pitched wail and liked to be bounced. Baby B preferred to be walked, her small body relaxing only when Enza paced the narrow strip of floor between the kitchenette and the bathroom. Around 3 in the morning, Federico's breathing had changed. Faster, shallower, accompanied by small sounds of distress. When Enza pressed her hand to his forehead, his skin burned beneath her palm. Fever. Of course there was fever. She'd stitched him up in an apartment with supplies from under her sink. Infection was practically guaranteed. She'd spent the next 2 hours in a state of controlled panic, alternating between checking his temperature with the back of her hand and cooling him down with damp cloths. She'd crushed up the last of her expired ibuprofen and managed to get him to swallow it with water, though he barely surfaced to consciousness. His temperature climbed to what felt like 104, maybe higher, and all Enza could do was pray that her stitches held and that whatever infection was raging through him wouldn't kill him before morning. By 5 a.m., when the first gray light began seeping through her single window, his fever finally broke. Enza felt the change under her hand, his burning skin cooling degree by degree until his temperature felt almost normal. His breathing even out, deeper and more regular. The tension that had been holding her upright for hours released all at once, and she slumped in her chair, exhausted beyond measure. That was when his eyes opened. One moment he was unconscious, the next he was awake and alert, his dark gaze sharp and focused despite everything he'd been through. His eyes swept the room in a practiced assessment, taking in the apartment, the sleeping babies, Enza herself sitting vigil beside him. "How long?" His voice was rough, scrape raw but steady. "About 6 hours, Enza said, sitting up straighter. "You had a fever. It broke maybe 20 minutes ago." Federico tried to sit up and immediately went pale, his jaw clenching against obvious pain. Enza moved without thinking, sliding her arm behind his shoulders to help him, adjusting the pillows she'd propped against her headboard. "Don't," she said when he started to speak. "You need to rest. You lost a lot of blood." The girls. His gaze had locked onto the sleeping twins. "Are they?" "They're fine. Fed, changed, sleeping. I've been watching them." Enza followed his gaze to the babies, their tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful synchronization. "They're beautiful." Something in Federico's expression cracked, just for a moment. Raw grief flickered across his features before he locked it away behind a mask of control. But Enza had seen it, that flash of devastating loss, and suddenly she understood. "Their mother," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Federico's silence was answer enough. He stared at his daughters with an expression that made Enza's chest ache. Love and anguish tangled together so tightly they were inseparable. "She died," he finally said, his accent thicker now, roughened by emotion. 3 months ago, bringing them into the world." Enza closed her eyes briefly. 3 months. These babies had never known their mother. This man had lost his wife and gained 2 daughters in the same moment. Grief and joy arriving as inseparable twins. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. "Complications," Federico continued, as if now that he'd started talking, he couldn't stop. "The doctors, they said everything would be fine. Routine, they said. But her blood pressure during the delivery." He stopped, swallowing hard. "By the time they got the babies out, she was already gone. I held my daughters for the first time, and she was already gone." Enza felt tears prick her eyes. She'd seen grief before, intimate and up close, but there was something particularly devastating about Federico's, the way he held it like a wound that would never quite heal. "Were their names?" she asked. "Isabella." He nodded toward baby A. "And Julia?" "Baby B, the one who liked to be walked." "After their grandmothers. Both gone now, like their mother." The weight of legacy and loss hung heavy in the small apartment. Enza looked at Isabella and Julia, these tiny perfect beings who'd been born in a tragedy, and felt something fierce and protective surge through her. "Can you hold them?" she asked suddenly. "I think they should be with their father." Federico looked at her, something unreadable in his dark eyes. Then he nodded just once. Enza carefully lifted Isabella from her cushioned nest, the baby stirring but not waking. She moved to the bed and gently, so gently, settled the infant in the crook of Federico's right arm, away from his injured shoulder. His whole body seemed to soften as his daughter's weight settled against him, his large hand carefully supporting her small head. "And Julia," Enza said, retrieving the second twin. This was trickier with his left side injured, but they managed. Enza helped position Julia on his chest, the baby's small body fitting perfectly in the space between her father's heart and his bandaged shoulder. Both twins relaxed immediately, as if recognizing on some primal level that they were exactly where they belonged. Federico looked down at his daughters, and the mask he'd been wearing since he woke crumbled completely. His eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide, one hand gently stroking Isabella's downy head while Julia made small, contented sounds against his chest. "I thought I'd lost them," he said, his voice breaking. "When the shooting started, all I could think was that I had to get them out, that I couldn't let them." He stopped, unable to finish. Enza perched on the edge of the bed, giving them space but staying close. "Who is shooting at you?" Federico's jaw tightened. "People who believe my children are leverage, who think that taking them would give them power over things that aren't theirs to take. A rival family," Enza said, remembering his earlier words in the alley. "Not your family." He met her gaze, and she saw him making a calculation, weighing how much truth to share with this stranger who'd saved his life. "The Calabrese organization. They've been trying to move into territory that's been held by my family for 3 generations. They thought after Maria died, after I was grieving, they could push. They were wrong." The way he said it, flat and final, sent a chill down Enza's spine. This was a man who'd been underestimated and had made someone pay for that mistake. "But they found out about the girls," Federico continued. "Somehow they learned I'd kept them hidden, kept them safe. Yesterday, they came for them. Shot up the car, killed my driver." His hand tightened fractionally on Isabella. "I got away with the girls, but I was hit. I knew I couldn't go to any of my properties, couldn't go to any of my people. They'd be watching everywhere. So I ran, and ended up in my alley." Enza finished. "And you saved us." Federico looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Why? You could have called the police. Should have called them. Instead, you risked everything. Why? Enza thought of Marco, of the guilt that had shaped the last 9 years of her life, of the choice she'd made tonight to finally act when someone needed her instead of arriving too late. Because you asked me to, she said simply. Because they needed you. Because. She trailed off, searching for words. Because sometimes you get a second chance to do the right thing, and you have to take it. Federico studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeing more than she was comfortable with. Then he nodded slowly, as if she'd passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. Thank you, Enza Costa, he said softly, for my life and for my daughter's lives. I won't forget this. The way he said it sounded like both a promise and a warning. Enza had saved him, yes, but in doing so, she'd bound herself to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. She looked at the gun still sitting on her kitchen table, at the briefcase full of cash, at this dangerous, grieving man holding his infant daughters with infinite tenderness. What happens now? She asked. Federico shifted slightly, settling both twins more securely against him. Now, he said, we figure out how to keep them safe until I can get us somewhere they'll never be found. And you, Enza, you need to decide how much of your life you're willing to risk for strangers. But they didn't feel like strangers anymore. Not after this endless night of blood and tears and tiny bottles prepared in the dark. Not after she'd seen this powerful man break down and put himself back together for the sake of his children. I'm already in it, Enza said, meeting his gaze steadily. So tell me what you need. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside apartment 3C, 3 people who'd been strangers 12 hours ago became something else entirely. Something bound by necessity and desperation and a shared understanding that some choices, once made, changed everything. Enza spent the next hour moving through the mechanics of survival. She helped Federico drink water, checked his bandages for fresh bleeding, prepared 2 more bottles when the twins woke hungry and fussing. The domesticity of it felt surreal, like playing house in the middle of a war zone. By 7 a.m., both babies were fed and dozing again, and Federico had managed to eat half of the toast she'd made him. Color had returned to his face, though he still looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes and pain etched in the lines around his mouth. Enza had been avoiding the real conversation they needed to have. But as she watched him struggle to button the clean shirt she'd found in the back of her closet, a shirt that had belonged to an ex-boyfriend and barely fit across Federico's broader shoulders, she knew she couldn't put it off any longer. I need the truth, she said, settling into the chair across from where he sat on the edge of the bed. All of it, not just pieces. Federico's hands stilled on the buttons. You already know enough to be in danger. I'm already in danger. Enza kept her voice level, though her heart hammered against her ribs. I have a wounded man and 2 babies in my apartment. I have a gun on my kitchen table and enough cash in that briefcase to make me look like an accomplice to something. I've committed at least 3 crimes I can think of, probably more. So don't tell me I know enough. Tell me everything. He looked at her for a long moment, weighing her words. Then he nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. My name is Federico Trinity, he began, and even through the fatigue and pain, there was power in the way he said it. Pride. My family has been in New York for 4 generations. My great-grandfather came from Calabria in 1923 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to build something that would last. Enza felt ice settle in her stomach. Trentini. The name rang bells, distant and ominous. She'd heard it before, whispered in the diner, mentioned in news reports she'd half listened to. What did he build? She asked, though she already knew. An empire. Federico's gaze was steady, unflinching. We control construction, shipping, waste management. We have our hands in unions, in city contracts, in businesses from here to Newark. Restaurants, clubs, real estate. Some of it legal, most of it gray, some of it. He paused. Some of it very much not legal. Your Mafia, Enza said flatly. We prefer family business, Federico said with a ghost of dark humor. But yes, The Trinity family is one of the 5 major organizations controlling organized crime in New York. Or we were, until recently. What changed? Maria died. The grief in his voice was still raw, still bleeding. And the other families saw weakness, especially the Calabrese. They've been trying to expand for years, trying to take territory that's been ours since my grandfather's time. They thought, with me distracted by mourning, by twin infants, they could push. They thought I'd be too broken to fight back. Were they right? Enza asked quietly. Federico's expression hardened, and suddenly she could see the man he must be in his world. Not the grieving widower, not the desperate father, but the leader, the boss. I buried my wife and spent 3 months in hell, he said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. But I'm still a Trinity. I'm still the head of this family. And no one takes what's mine. The intensity of it should have frightened her. Instead, Enza found herself leaning forward. So you fought back. I reminded them why my family has held power for 90 years, Federico said. I cut off their supply lines, made examples of their lieutenants, took back every inch they tried to claim. I was winning, Enza, but then they changed tactics. They went after Isabella and Julia. They found out about them. Federico's hands clenched into fists. I kept them hidden, kept them safe. No one outside my inner circle knew I'd had daughters. But someone talked, or someone saw, and the Calabrese decided the fastest way to break me was through my children. Enza looked at the sleeping twins, so small and innocent, and felt rage bloom hot in her chest. They would have killed babies. Worse. Federico's voice dropped to something deadly. They would have taken them, raised them as their own, used them as leverage for the rest of my life. I would have had to watch my daughters grow up calling another man father, knowing that one wrong move and they'd be hurt or killed. That's the game they play. Enza, that's the world I come from. The apartment felt smaller, suddenly, the walls pressing in. Enza stood and moved to the window, staring out at the brick wall beyond. Her mind raced, trying to process everything he'd told her. How many people have you killed? She asked, the question coming out before she could stop it. Silence stretched behind her. When Federico finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Enough that I stopped counting years ago. Enza closed her eyes. She should be horrified. Should be calling the police right now. Consequences be damned. This man was a criminal, a killer, the head of an organization that thrived on violence and intimidation, and God only knew what else. But when she turned around, she didn't see a monster. She saw the father cradling the edge of the bed because sitting up too long made his shoulder bleed. She saw a widower who'd wept over his daughters. She saw a man who'd chosen to bleed out in an alley rather than risk leading danger to innocent babies. Are you going to leave? Federico asked. Walk away from this? I wouldn't blame you. Where would I go? Enza said. Back to Rosie's like nothing happened? Pretend I didn't see anything? They saw my truck, Federico. Someone might have seen me loading you in. If your enemies are looking for you, how long before they come looking for the waitress who helped you disappear? The truth of it settled between them like a third presence in the room. She thought she was making a choice to help. She hadn't realized she was choosing her side in a war. I can protect you, Federico said. When this is over, when I get my daughters to safety, I can make sure you're protected. Give you enough money to disappear. Start over somewhere new. I can. Stop. Enza held up a hand. Just stop. I don't want your money, and I don't want to disappear. I want to understand what I'm dealing with. So tell me, what happens now? What's the plan? Federico looked at her with something like respect. I have people I trust. Not many, but enough. I need to make contact, arrange a safe house somewhere outside the city. Somewhere remote, where Isabella and Julia can grow up away from all of this. Away from the family business, Enza said. Yes. Federico's voice was firm. I'm tired of this life, Enza. Tired of the violence, the constant threats, the weight of carrying my family's legacy. I've done things I'm not proud of, things I can never take back. But I won't let my daughters inherit this. I won't let them grow up the way I did, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering who they can trust. But you're not tired of the name, Enza said, remembering his earlier words about being a Trinity. Never. Bastille returned to his voice. I'm proud of what my family built, proud of who we are. The Trinity name means something. It means loyalty, honor, family above all else. That part won't want my daughters to know. That part I'll never apologize for. Enza moved back to her chair, studying him. So you won't leave the life, but keep the legacy. Is that even possible? It has to be. Federico met her gaze. Because the alternative is raising them in this world, and I've already lost too much to it. I won't lose them too. The conviction in his voice, the sheer force of will behind it, was almost palpable. This was a man who'd bent an entire city to his will, who'd built and maintained power through sheer determination. If anyone could walk away from this life and survive, it would be him. How long do we have? Enza asked. Before they find us here? I don't know. Days, maybe. A week if we're lucky. Federico shifted, wincing at the pain. The longer we stay in one place, the more dangerous it becomes. But I can't move yet, not like this. I need at least another day to heal enough to travel. Another day, 24 more hours in this apartment, hiding, waiting, pretending the world outside didn't exist. It should have felt impossible. Instead, Enza felt a strange calm settle over her. Then we have a day, she said, to keep you alive and keep them safe. After that, we figure out the next step. Federico raised an eyebrow. I'm not letting you take 2 3-month-old babies to a safe house alone when you can barely stand up, Enza said. At least not until I know you're actually going to survive this. Something flickered in Federico's expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. You're either very brave or very foolish, Enza Costa. Probably both, she admitted. But I made my choice in that alley, and I'm not backing out now. Federico nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Then I suppose we're in this together. Outside, the morning traffic had picked up, the sounds of the city going about its normal routines. Inside apartment 3C, nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. But as Enza looked at the sleeping twins, at their father who was willing to walk away from everything he knew to keep them safe, she thought maybe normal was overrated anyway. Get some rest, she told Federico. I'll watch over them. And you. Thank you, he said quietly, for understanding, or at least for trying to. Enza didn't respond. She wasn't sure she understood any of this. But understanding wasn't what mattered right now. What mattered was survival and safety and giving 2 innocent babies a chance at a life their mother would have wanted for them. Everything else, they'd figure out as they went. The first call Enza made was to Rosie. Her phone pressed to her ear while she stood in the bathroom with the door closed, speaking in a low voice. I can't come in today, she said, forcing a cough that sounded more convincing than she'd expected. I think I caught something. Fever, body aches, the whole thing. You sound terrible, honey, Rosie said, concern heavy in her voice. You need anything? I can have Marco drop off some soup. No, I just need to sleep it off. Enza closed her eyes, hating the lie, but seeing no alternative. I'll call you tomorrow. Let you know if I'm feeling better. You take care of yourself. And Enza, don't even think about coming back until you're well. I mean it. The guilt sat heavy in Enza's stomach as she ended the call. She'd never missed a shift in 4 years, never called in sick, even when she actually was. Now she was lying to the one person who'd given her a chance when she dropped out of medical school with nothing but debt and shame. When she emerged from the bathroom, Federico was attempting to stand, one hand braced against the wall, his face gray with effort. What are you doing? Enza crossed the small space in 3 strides, sliding her arm under his good shoulder. You're supposed to be resting. I can't just lie there, Federico growled, frustration sharpening his accent. I need to move, You need to heal. Enza guided him back to the bed with more force than she'd intended. Sit down before you tear your stitches, and I have to sew you back together again. He sat, but the look he gave her was pure rebellion. I've had worse injuries than this. I don't need to be treated like an invalid. You were shot less than 24 hours ago, Enza said flatly. You're not invincible, no matter what you're used to. So sit, rest, let your body do what it needs to do. They stared at each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Federico looked away, first, his jaw tight, with reluctant acceptance. Fine, he muttered. But I don't like it. You don't have to like it, Enza said, moving to check on the twins. You just have to do it. And so began their strange, tense domesticity. The days blurred together in a rhythm dictated by the twins' needs. Every 3 hours, like clockwork, Isabella or Julia or both would wake crying, and Enza would prepare bottles, change diapers, rock small bodies until they settled. Federico watched from a bed, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow didn't. By the second day, he was sitting up without help, though his shoulders still caused him obvious pain. Enza changed his bandages twice daily, cleaning the wounds with careful precision, noting with relief that the angry redness of infection was fading. Her stitches held, crude as they were. You should have been a doctor, Federico said on the third morning as she worked. His voice was quiet, thoughtful. Enza's hand stilled for just a moment. I was going to be. What happened? She resumed, wrapping the fresh bandage, not meeting his eyes. Life happened. My brother died. I couldn't focus anymore, couldn't see the point. So I quit, moved back home, and started waiting tables. Your brother, Federico said softly. That's why you helped us. Why you couldn't walk away. Maybe. Enza tied off the bandage more forcefully than necessary. Or maybe I'm just an idiot who makes terrible decisions. Not terrible, Federico said. Dangerous, yes, but not terrible. By the fourth day, Federico was walking the length of the apartment, slow, careful circuits that left him breathing hard but standing straighter. Enza had started venturing out for supplies, quick trips to the corner store where she bought formula and diapers and frozen meals she could heat up quickly. She kept her head down, paid in cash, and tried not to think about security cameras or people who might be watching. The nights were the hardest and, somehow, the easiest all at once. Enza had taken to sleeping on the floor beside the twins, curled up on the couch cushions with a thin blanket. Federico remained in her bed, though he tried to insist on switching. She'd refused, pointing out that he needed actual rest to heal and that she'd slept in worse places. But the twins didn't care about sleeping arrangements. When they woke at 2 a.m., then 5 a.m., then 7, both Enza and Federico would stir. At first, Enza had tried to handle the feedings alone, but Federico had insisted on helping, and she'd learned it was easier with 2 sets of hands. Those quiet hours in the middle of the night, the apartment dark except for the small lamp on the kitchen counter, became something almost sacred. They'd sit together, each holding a twin, bottles tilted at the right angle, and they'd talk in voices barely above whispers. Maria wanted to name them after flowers, Federico said one night, his fingers gentle on Julia's downy head. Rose and Lily, she said. Very American. But I told her they should have names that connected them to where we came from. She argued with me for weeks. Who won? Enza asked, smiling slightly. We compromised. Isabella and Julia with Rose and Lily as middle names. Federico's expression softened with memory. She was stubborn. I think that's what I loved most about her. She never backed down, even from me. How did you meet? At a wedding. She was the bride's cousin, visiting from Chicago. I saw her across the room and knew. Federico shook his head. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Love at first sight. But with Maria, it was true. I knew that night I'd marry her. And did she know? Enza asked. Not at first. She made me work for it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. 6 months of phone calls, flying to Chicago every weekend, convincing her that my world wasn't as dark as she feared, or at least that it was worth the risk. Was it? The question came out before Enza could stop it. Worth the risk? Federico looked down at his daughter. I had 3 years with her. 3 years of happiness I never thought I'd have. She gave me Isabella and Julia. So yes, it was worth it. Even knowing how it ended, I'd make the same choice. The grief in his voice was still present, still raw, but there was acceptance too. A man learning to carry his loss rather than being crushed by it. Another night, Enza found herself talking about Marco, about the party she'd been at when he'd had his asthma attack, about how she'd been too drunk and too distracted to answer her phone. about arriving at the hospital to find him already on a ventilator, brain damage from lack of oxygen, and the 4 days they'd waited before her parents made the decision to let him go. "I never forgave myself," she said, her voice thick. "He was 14. He needed me, and I wasn't there." "You were 17, Federico said. "A child yourself. Old enough to know better. Old enough to have been responsible." Enza looked down at Isabella, sleeping in her arms. "That's why I couldn't leave you in that alley. Couldn't make that same choice again." "You saved 3 lives that night," Federico said quietly. "Your brother would be proud of that. You should be proud of that." Enza didn't respond, couldn't trust her voice. But later, after they'd put the twins back down and returned to their separate sleeping spaces, she thought about his words. Thought about the weight she'd been carrying for 9 years and how it felt, just slightly, a little lighter. By the 5th day, they'd settled into a routine that felt almost comfortable. Enza would wake first, prepare bottles, start coffee. Federico would emerge from the bedroom, moving more easily, the stiffness leaving his body as his shoulder healed. They'd feed the twins together. Then Enza would check his bandages while he held whichever baby wasn't being fussy. "You're healing well," she said that morning, examining the stitches. "Another week, and these can probably come out." "We don't have another week," Federico said, his voice tight. "I need to make contact with my people soon. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." "Your phone," Enza said. "You haven't used it since we got here." "Can't. They could be tracking it, monitoring my contacts. The moment I turn it on, I'm giving away our location." Federico shifted Isabella to his other arm. "But I can't stay silent forever. My second in command, Luca, he'll be losing his mind. And without direction for me, things could fall apart." "Your empire," Enza said. "My responsibility." Federico met her gaze. "These people depend on me. Their families, their livelihoods. I can't just disappear without making sure they're protected." It should have bothered her, this casual discussion of criminal enterprise. Instead, Enza found herself understanding. Whatever else Federico was, he took his obligations seriously. He cared about the people under his protection, even if that protection came wrapped in violence and moral ambiguity. That night, during the 2 a.m. feeding, Federico asked her about her dreams. "Before your brother died," he clarified, "what did you want to be?" "A surgeon," Enza said without hesitation. "Trauma surgery, specifically. I wanted to be the person who saved lives when it mattered most." "You still could be." Enza laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm 26, working at a diner. With student loans I'll be paying off until I'm 50. That ship sailed a long time ago." "Ships can return to port," Federico said. "You have skills, Enza, real skills. You saved my life with supplies from under your sink. Imagine what you could do with proper training, proper resources." "It's a nice fantasy," she said. "It doesn't have to be fantasy." Federico's gaze was intense in the dim light. "When this is over, when Isabella and Julia are safe, I could help you. Pay for school, set you up somewhere you could finish your training. You could have the life you were supposed to have." The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Enza looked at this man, this criminal who somehow saw more potential in her than she'd seen in herself for years, and didn't know what to say. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked. "Because you saved my daughters," Federico said simply. "And because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted serving coffee to truckers. No offense to your profession." "None taken," Enza said, though her mind was spinning. They sat in comfortable silence after that. The only sounds the soft sucking noises of babies drinking and the distant hum of the city outside. And Enza let herself imagine, just for a moment, a future where she wasn't trapped by her past, where she could be the person she'd once dreamed of becoming. It was dangerous, that hope. But then again, everything about this situation was dangerous. What was one more risk? The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway shattered the quiet morning of their 6th day. Enza was at the kitchen counter preparing bottles when she heard them. Not the usual shuffle of Mrs. Chun from 3B going to collect her mail, or the quick clip of the college student in 3D rushing to class. These were deliberate, measured steps. The footsteps of men who wanted their presence known. She froze, bottle in hand, her eyes darting to Federico, He was already moving, faster than she'd seen him move since the shooting. He crossed to the window in 3 strides, peering down at the street through the gap in the curtain. "Black SUV," he said, his voice tight and low. "Tinted windows. They're here." Enza's heart slammed against her ribs. "Are you sure? It could be. It's them." Federico moved away from the window, his hand instinctively going to his injured shoulder. "They found us." The footsteps stopped, right outside her door. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Enza could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, could hear the soft sounds of Isabella and Julia sleeping in their makeshift beds, oblivious to the danger just feet away. Then came a knock. 3 heavy thuds that made Enza jump. Not the polite knock of a neighbor or a delivery person. This was a knock that demanded attention, that expected doors to be opened immediately. "Ms. Costa," a man's voice, rough and accented. Not Italian, something else. Eastern European, maybe. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Federico's hand wrapped around Enza's wrist, pulling her away from the door. His grip was iron, his dark eyes blazing with an intensity that was part warning, part command. "Stay quiet," that look said. "Don't move. Don't breathe." Another knock, harder this time. "We're looking for someone," the voice continued, taking on a false pleasantness that was somehow worse than outright threat. "A man, injured, maybe with children. You seen anyone like that? We heard you might have helped someone a few nights ago." "That true?" Enza's mind raced. How did they know? Had someone seen her loading Federico into the truck? Had they traced her license plate? Checked security cameras? The possibilities spiraled through her thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. The doorknob rattled. Not a gentle test, but a hard, deliberate shake. Someone was trying the lock, seeing if it would give. Enza's apartment door was old, the lock flimsy. She'd never bothered to upgrade it because she'd never had anything worth stealing. Until now, Federico moved with surprising speed for an injured man. He grabbed the briefcase from under the bed, flipped it open, and pulled out the gun. The weight of it in his hand transformed him, the wounded father disappearing behind the mask of the man he'd been before. The boss, the killer. "Get the babies," he whispered, moving toward the door. The fire escape outside the bathroom window. "Go now. I'm not leaving you," Enza whispered back, her voice fierce despite her terror. "Enza," Federico started. The doorknob rattled again, harder. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the small apartment. They were picking the lock. "Get behind me," Federico said, abandoning the argument. He positioned himself between the door and where the twins slept, the gun held with practiced ease despite his injured shoulder. Enza moved on instinct, scooping up both car seats, the twins stirring but not waking. She carried them to the bathroom, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. The window above the toilet was small, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, leading to a rusted fire escape she'd never once used. She could go, could climb out with the babies, make her way down to the alley, disappear into the city. Save herself and Isabella and Julia while Federico dealt with whatever came through that door. The lock clicked. The door began to open. Enza set the car seats in the bathtub, the safest place she could think of, and turned back toward the main room. Her feet carried her forward even as her brain screamed at her to run. She emerged from the bathroom just as 2 men stepped into her apartment. They were exactly what she'd expected. Thick-necked, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark suits that did nothing to hide the muscle beneath. The kind of men who made their living through intimidation and violence. One had a scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw. The other wore a gold chain that caught the light as he moved. Both stopped when they saw Federico, gun raised, positioned with his back to the bedroom. "Well," Scarface said, a smile spreading across his brutish features. "Look what we found. The lost prince of the Trinity family." "Get out," Federico said, his voice deadly calm. "You're not welcome here." Goldchain laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "That's not very hospitable, Trentini. We came all this way to find you. Least you could do is invite us in for coffee." "You're already in," Federico said, "and you're already leaving. Question is whether you walk out or get carried. Big words for a man who can barely stand, Scarface said, his eyes cataloging Federico's obvious injury, the way he favored his left side. We heard he got clipped. Looks like they heard right. Enza's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream at these men, to throw them out herself, but she forced herself to stay still, to not draw attention, to not become a target. Where are the Bambinos? Gold Chain asked, his gaze sweeping the apartment. We know you had them with you. 2 little girls, yes? Don Calabrese would very much like to meet them. Over my dead body, Federico said. That can be arranged. Scarface took a step forward. The gun in Federico's hand never wavered, but Enza saw the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor that spoke of pain and exhaustion. He was in no shape for a fight. These men knew it. They were predators scenting blood in the water. Here's how this is going to work, Scarface continued, emboldened by Federico's obvious weakness. You're going to put down that gun and come with us. Nice and peaceful. Don Calabrese wants to have a conversation about territory, about respect, about the future of this city. And you're going to bring those pretty little girls so he knows you're serious about cooperating. No, Federico said simply. No. Gold Chain raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to refuse, Trentini. We've got men downstairs, men watching the building. You think you can shoot us both before one of us gets to you? You think you can get out of here with 2 babies and that waitress without us catching you? That waitress. The words made Enza's blood run cold. They knew about her, knew who she was, what she'd done. There would be no walking away from this, no pretending it never happened. She'd chosen a side in that alley 6 nights ago, and now the consequences were standing in her apartment. The waitress has nothing to do with this, Federico said, his voice harder now. She was a bystander who got caught up in something that wasn't her business. Let her go. You want me, you have me. But she walks free. That's sweet, Scarface said mockingly. Trinity's got a soft spot for the help. But see, she's already involved. She helped you, hid you, probably knows more than she should. Can't have loose ends walking around, can we? The implication hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. They weren't going to let her go. Whether she cooperated or not, whether she ran or stayed, these men had already decided her fate. Something inside Enza snapped. Get out of my apartment, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Right now, all 3 men turned to look at her as if they'd forgotten she was there. Gold Chain laughed again. And what are you going to do, princess? Call the cops? Tell them there's a mob boss and his babies hiding in your studio? I don't think so. Enza, Federico said urgently. Take the girls and go. Now. She should have listened. Should have grabbed the twins and climbed out that bathroom window while she still could. But she thought of Marco, of arriving too late, of living with that failure for 9 years. She thought of Isabella and Julia, innocent and perfect, and depending on the adults around them to keep them safe. I'm not leaving you or the babies, Enza said, meeting Federico's eyes across the small room. Not now. Something flickered in his expression. Frustration, fear, and beneath it all, something that looked like respect. How touching, Scarface said. Young love and all that. But playtime's over. You're both coming with us, along with the kids. Don Calabrese is a patient man, but he's been waiting 6 days for Trinity to resurface. Time to end this little game of hide and seek. He took another step forward. That was when everything went wrong. Federico fired. The gunshot was deafening in the small apartment. The muzzle flashed bright in the morning light. Scarface jerked backward, clutching his shoulder, blood already seeping between his fingers. Gold Chain moved fast, faster than a man his size should have been able to, lunging toward Federico. They collided in a tangle of limbs, Federico's injured shoulder making him slower than usual. The gun clattered to the floor. Gold Chain's fist connected with Federico's bandaged shoulder, and he made a sound Enza would hear in her nightmares, a howl of pure agony. Enza didn't think, couldn't think. She grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, a heavy cast-iron skillet that had been sitting on the stove, and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pan connected with Gold Chain's head with a sickening thunk. He dropped like a stone, blood matting his hair, his body going limp on her floor. For a moment, nobody moved. Scarface was on his knees, still clutching his bleeding shoulder. Gold Chain was unconscious, maybe worse. Federico was pressed against the wall, breathing hard, his bandages soaked red. And Enza stood in the middle of her apartment, cast iron skillet still raised, realizing she'd just assaulted a member of the Mafia. "We need to go," Federico said, breaking the frozen moment. "Right now. They'll call for backup the second we didn't answer that door." Scarface was fumbling for something in his jacket. Federico moved, scooped up his gun, and brought it down hard on the man's head. He crumpled beside his partner. "Enza!" Federico grabbed her arm, snapping her out of her shock. "The babies. Now." She dropped the skillet and ran for the bathroom. Isabella and Julia were awake now, crying from the noise and commotion. Enza grabbed both car seats, her entire body shaking with adrenaline. When she returned to the main room, Federico had the briefcase in one hand, his gun in the other. He looked pale, pain etched deep in his features, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Where?" Enza asked, her voice coming out steady despite everything. "Fire escape," Federico said. "Down to the alley. My truck's 3 blocks north, the one I told you about. Blue Escalade, keys under the driver's side wheel well." They didn't discuss it further. There was no time. They could already hear voices in the hallway, heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs. More men, coming to see what the gunshot was about. Federico went first, squeezing through the bathroom window with obvious difficulty, his injured shoulder making every movement agony. Enza passed him the car seats one at a time, then climbed through herself, her apartment key left behind on the counter next to a half-made bottle and the life she'd been living just 6 days ago. The fire escape groaned under their weight as they descended, rust flaking off under their hands. Behind them, Enza heard the door to her apartment slam open, heard shouts and curses as the newcomers discovered their fallen comrades. "Faster," Federico urged, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite his injury. They hit the alley running, Federico clutching the briefcase and one car seat, Enza with the other twin and her heart trying to beat out her chest. The sound of pursuit echoed from above, men spilling onto the fire escape, voices raised in anger. 3 blocks. They had to make it 3 blocks. Enza had never run so fast in her life. Her lungs burned, her arms screamed from the weight of the car seat, but she didn't slow down. Beside her, Federico moved with grim determination despite the fresh blood seeping through his shirt. Behind them, shouts echoed off the brick buildings, footsteps pounding closer. The blue Escalade sat where Federico had said it would be, parked between a delivery van and a rusted sedan. Enza nearly sobbed with relief when she saw it. Federico dropped to one knee, fumbling under the wheel well for the keys while Enza stood guard with both twins, her eyes scanning the street for pursuit. The engine roared to life. They threw the car seats into the back, clicking them into place with shaking hands. Enza barely had her door closed before Federico hit the gas, the SUV lurching forward just as 2 men rounded the corner behind them. They drove in tense silence for 20 minutes, Federico taking random turns, doubling back, making sure they weren't followed. Only when they crossed into New Jersey did some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Where are we going?" Enza finally asked, her voice hoarse. "Somewhere safe," Federico said. "A place I keep for emergencies. No one knows about it except Luca, and he'd die before giving it up." The safe house turned out to be a small cabin tucked into the woods outside Princeton, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense trees. It was rustic but well-maintained, with solar panels on the roof and bars on the windows that spoke of paranoia earned through experience. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with actual hot water. There were supplies too, canned food, bottled water, a generator in the shed outside. Everything needed for a long-term stay. "How long have you had this place?" Enza asked, setting the twins down on the leather couch. 5 years, Federico said, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter. "Since the last time someone tried to kill me. I learned then that you always need an exit strategy, a place to disappear when things go wrong. Things have definitely gone wrong, Enza muttered. She turned to look at Federico and felt her stomach drop. His face was gray, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. The makeshift bandage she'd applied before they fled was soaked through, red spreading across his chest. "You're bleeding," she said, moving toward him. "Bad. Sit down before you fall down." For once, Federico didn't argue. He let her guide him to one of the kitchen chairs. His breathing labored. Enza carefully peeled away his shirt, hissing when she saw the damage. Several of her stitches had torn, probably during the fight with Gold Chain. The wound was angry and inflamed, bleeding freely. "I need to restitch this," she said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Please tell me there's a first aid kit somewhere in this place." "Bathroom," Federico managed. "Cabinet under the sink." The first aid kit was professional grade, the kind used by field medics. Enza sent up a silent prayer of thanks as she gathered supplies. This time she had proper suturing thread, sterile gauze, even local anesthetic. Not perfect, but so much better than her apartment. She worked in the kitchen, Federico straddling the chair backward so she could access his shoulder properly. The twins had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the chaos. For an hour, the only sounds were Enza's careful breathing, the clink of instruments, and Federico's occasional sharp intake of breath when she hit a particularly sensitive spot. "I'm sorry," she murmured, tying off another stitch. "I know it hurts." "I've had worse," Federico said, though his knuckles were white where he gripped the chair back. "When Sicily, 7 years ago, took a knife to the ribs during a negotiation that went badly. 14 stitches without anesthetic." He managed a weak smile. "This is luxury in comparison." "You've lived a terrible life," Enza said softly, snipping the thread. "Parts of it," Federico agreed, "but not all of it. Maria was the best 3 years I ever had. And Isabella and Julia, they're worth every terrible thing that came before." Enza finished the last stitch and began wrapping fresh bandages. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but she was acutely aware of the warmth of Federico's skin under her fingers, the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the way his muscles tensed and relaxed as she worked. "There," she said, securing the bandage with tape. "That should hold better, but you need to be careful. No more fights with Mafia enforcers for at least a week." "I'll try to restrain myself," Federico said dryly. He started to stand, but his legs gave out. Enza caught him, her arms wrapping around his waist, taking his weight. For a moment they stood frozen, pressed together in the small kitchen, so close she could feel his heart beating against her chest. "Sorry," Federico murmured, but he didn't pull away. "It's okay," Enza said, though her own heart was racing now for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or adrenaline. "Let me help you to the bedroom." They moved slowly, Federico leaning heavily on her, his good arm draped across her shoulders. The bedroom was small but clean, dominated by a queen-size bed with a thick quilt. Enza helped Federico sit on the edge, then knelt to remove his shoes. "You don't have to," he started. "Yes, I do," Enza said firmly. "You just saved both our lives back there. Least I can do is help you into bed." She untied his shoes, pulled them off, then helped him swing his legs up onto the mattress. When she started to pull away, his hand caught her wrist. "Enza," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you. For not running. For staying." "Where else would I go?" she asked, trying to make it light, but the words came out more serious than she'd intended. Federico's thumb traced small circles on the inside of her wrist, and Enza felt that touch everywhere. His dark eyes were locked on hers, intense and searching, looking for something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "You could have left me," he said. "Should have left me. Any rational person would have." "I'm learning I'm not very rational," Enza said softly. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. Federico's hand slid from her wrist up her arm, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. When his fingers brushed the side of her neck, Enza's breath caught. "This is a bad idea," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "Terrible," Federico agreed, but he was leaning closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. The space between them shrank to inches, then less. Enza could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the copper tang of blood mixed with his cologne. Her eyes started to close, her body swaying toward his almost of its own volition. Then reality crashed back in. Enza jerked backward, nearly stumbling in her haste to put distance between them. Her hand went to her mouth, as if she could somehow take back the almost kiss, could undo whatever had just happened. "I can't," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't. This is... Federico, you're a criminal. You kill people. You run an empire built on violence and intimidation and God knows what else. I hit someone with a frying pan today, and I don't even know if he's alive. My entire life just fell apart because I made one choice in an alley, and now I'm hiding in the woods with a man I barely know and two babies that aren't mine, and this." She gestured between them. "This can't be real. It can't." Federico sat back, his expression carefully neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "Hurt. Maybe you're understanding." "You're right," he said quietly. "This situation, it's not real. We're not real. You're here because you saved my life, and now you're caught up in the consequences. That's all this is." But even as he said it, Enza knew it was a lie. This was real. The connection between them, forged through shared danger and quiet conversations in the dark, was terrifyingly real. And that was exactly the problem. "I need air," Enza said, backing toward the door. "I'll check on the twins." She fled the room before Federico could respond, her heart hammering and her hand shaking. In the main room, Isabella and Julia slept on, peaceful and oblivious. Enza sank onto the couch beside them, pressing her palms to her eyes. What was she doing? A week ago, she'd been a waitress with a quiet, predictable life. Now she was an accessory to assault, possibly murder, definitely a dozen other crimes. She was on the run with a Mafia boss and his infant daughters, hiding in a cabin in the woods, and she just almost kissed him. No, not just almost kissed him. Almost wanted it. Still wanted it, if she was being honest with herself. But wanting something didn't make it right. Didn't make it possible. Federico Trinity was everything she wasn't, came from a world she couldn't understand, lived by rules that would get her killed or imprisoned. This arrangement, whatever it was, had an expiration date. Eventually he'd get his daughters to safety, settle whatever war he was fighting, and move on. And she'd be left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She couldn't let herself forget that. Couldn't let the intensity of their situation trick her into believing this was anything more than temporary survival. Even if every time he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she'd never experienced before. Even if the thought of him leaving made her chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with fear or stress. The bedroom door opened. Federico emerged, moving carefully, a clean shirt covering his fresh bandages. He didn't approach her, just leaned against the doorframe, studying her with those dark, knowing eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have. The situation made me forget myself." "It's fine," Enza said, though it wasn't fine at all. "We're both stressed, running on adrenaline. These things happen." "Do they?" Federico asked, and there was something in his voice that made Enza look up. "Because I don't think I've forgotten myself at all. I think maybe for the first time in years, I'm remembering who I could be. Who I want to be." "Don't," Enza said, fear sharpening her voice. "Don't make this into something it's not. I'm helping you because I couldn't walk away, because those babies need both of us right now. But when this is over, we go our separate ways. That's how this has to end." Federico was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "If that's what you need to believe," he said, "then I won't argue. But Enza, you're lying to yourself if you think this is just about obligation. For either of us." He turned and went back into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. Enza sat alone with the sleeping twins, her mind spinning, her heart a confused tangle of want and fear and stubborn denial. She'd made her position clear, drew the line that needed drawing. Soon, this would all be over, and she could go back to her normal life. Find a new apartment, probably a new job. Forget about Federico Trinity and the week that had turned her entire world upside down. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the only choice that made sense. So why did it feel like she was already mourning something she'd never really had. The days at the cabin blurred together in a strange sort of peace. They maintained a careful distance after that almost kiss, circling each other like planets in orbit, close but never quite touching. Their conversations stayed surface level during the day, focused on the twins' needs and Federico's healing. But at night, during the 2 a.m. feedings, the walls would come down just a little and they'd talk about things that mattered. Dreams and regrets and the people they'd lost. Federico's shoulder healed remarkably well. By the end of the first week, he was moving without pain, the angry red of the wounds fading to pink. By the second week, he was chopping wood for the fireplace, his movements fluid and powerful. The dangerous man fully returned. Enza tried not to notice the way his muscles moved under his shirt. Try not to feel the flutter in her stomach when he smiled at something Isabella did. She'd drawn her line. She was sticking to it, even if it was killing her. It was a Tuesday morning, 14 days after they'd fled her apartment, when everything changed. Enza was feeding Giulia on the couch, the baby's small hand wrapped around her finger, when Federico's phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet cabin. Federico had kept the phone off since they'd arrived, the risk of being tracked too great. But he told her 3 days ago that he'd have to turn it on eventually, that his people needed to hear from him. He'd waited until this morning, powering it on with visible reluctance. The phone had barely finished booting up when it started ringing. Federico looked at the screen, then at Enza. Something passed across his face, too quick to read. Relief, maybe, or resignation. "It's Luca," he said and answered. "Tell me." Enza couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Federico's face as he listened. Watched tension drain from his shoulders, watched his jaw unclench for the first time in 2 weeks. "You're certain?" Federico asked. A pause. "All of them?" Another pause, longer. "Good. Yes. Tonight." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. "What happened?" Enza asked, though part of her already knew. Could feel the shift in the air, the way reality was rearranging itself around them. "It's over," Federico said, his voice oddly flat. "The threat's been neutralized. The Calabrese family, their leadership, they've been dealt with. Luca's arranged safe passage to a house upstate, completely off the grid. We can leave tonight." "We." The word hung in the air, like a question neither of them wanted to answer. "That's good," Enza said, forcing brightness into her voice. "That's what we've been waiting for. Isabella and Giulia will be safe." "Yes," Federico said. He was still standing in the middle of the room, still holding that phone like it weighed 100 pounds. "They'll be safe." The rest of the day passed in a strange fog. Federico made arrangements. His phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in rapid Italian to people whose names Enza didn't know. She packed the few belongings they'd accumulated, folded the tiny clothes she'd washed by hand in the cabin's sink, prepared bottles for the journey. They moved around each other like ghosts, careful not to collide, both of them aware that something was ending. By evening, everything was ready. A car would arrive at 9 to take Federico and the twins to their new life. A safe life. A life that didn't include a waitress from Brooklyn who'd made one impulsive choice in a rainy alley. At 8:30, Federico emerged from the bedroom in clothes Luca had sent. A tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, expensive shoes. He looked like himself again, Enza realized. Not the wounded man she'd stitched up in her apartment, but Federico Trinity, head of one of New York's most powerful families. Untouchable, unreachable. "You look different," she said softly. "I'm going back to my world," Federico said. "I needed to look the part." He crossed to where she sat on the couch, the twins sleeping in their car seats beside her, ready to travel. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," he said, holding it out. "For everything you've done, everything you sacrificed." Enza took the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a check. Her eyes widened when she saw the amount. $200,000. "Federico, I can't." "You can and you will," he said, his voice firm. "It's enough to pay off your student loans. Go back to medical school if you want. Start over somewhere new. Forget any of this ever happened. Forget." The word landed like a blow. "That's what you want?" Enza asked, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. For me to forget. Federico's jaw tightened. I want you to be safe. To have the life you deserve. The life you would have had if you hadn't found me bleeding in that alley. And if I don't want that life? The words came out before Enza could stop them. If I can't just go back to serving coffee and pretending none of this happened. You have to, Federico said, and there was something desperate in his eyes now. Enza, you don't belong in my world. You saw what happened at your apartment. Those men, they'll always come. There will always be another threat, another war, another enemy trying to take what's mine. I can protect Isabella and Julia because they're my blood, because I'll build walls so high around them that no one will ever get through. But I'm not your blood, Enza finished bitterly. I'm just the waitress who helped you. A liability you need to pay off and forget about. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. Enza stood, the check crumpling in her fist. You know what? You're right. This was always temporary. I knew that. I told myself that every single day. So thank you for the money, and congratulations on neutralizing your threat, and I hope you and your daughters have a wonderful life in your fortress of safety. She tried to move past him, needing distance, needing air, but Federico's hand shot out and caught her wrist. Don't, he said, his voice raw. Don't make this harder than it already is. Harder for who? Enza jerked her wrist free, anger and hurt and 2 weeks of denied feelings boiling over. For you? Because from where I'm standing, this seems pretty easy for you. Write a check, say goodbye, move on with your life. Just another transaction, right? Just another problem solved. You think this is easy? Federico's voice rose, matching her anger. You think I want to let you walk away? You think I haven't spent every single night of the past 2 weeks trying to figure out how to keep you with us, and knowing I can't? The admission hung in the air between them, stunning them both into silence. Then don't, Enza whispered. Don't let me walk away. Federico closed his eyes, pain etched deep in his features. I have to, because if I'm selfish enough to ask you to stay, to be part of this life, you'll end up dead or worse. And I can't. His voice broke. I can't lose someone else I care about. I can't bury another person I love. Love. The word pierced through Enza's anger, leaving her breathless. You don't love me, she said, but it came out uncertain. You can't. We barely know each other. I know you stayed when anyone else would have run, Federico said, opening his eyes to look at her with devastating intensity. I know you refused to leave me or my daughters, even when men with guns were breaking down your door. I know the way you hum when you're making bottles at 3 a.m., and how you scrunch your nose when you're concentrating on something difficult. I know you're brave and stubborn and too good for the life I could offer you. That's not your choice to make, Enza said, tears burning in her eyes. Whether I'm too good for your life, whether the risk is worth it. That's my choice. And you choose this? Federico gestured around the cabin, at the guns he kept within reach, at the phone that connected him to a world of violence and power. You'd choose me and everything that comes with me? The danger, the secrets, the fact that people will always want to hurt those I care about. You'd choose to be a mother to children who aren't yours, knowing you could lose everything, including your life. Enza looked at Isabella and Julia, sleeping peacefully in their car seats. 2 beautiful babies who'd lost their mother and deserved every chance at happiness. She thought about the past 2 weeks, the way it had felt to be part of something, to be needed, to matter in ways that serving coffee had never made her feel. She thought about Federico, about the way he looked at his daughters with fierce protective love, the way he'd opened up to her during those quiet night conversations, the way her heart had started beating differently whenever he was near. Yes, she said simply, I'd choose it. All of it. I'd choose you. Federico stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. You're not thinking clearly. The adrenaline, the situation, it's made you believe. Don't. Enza cut him off. Don't tell me what I believe. Don't tell me what I feel. I'm 26 years old, Federico. I spent the last 9 years playing it safe, keeping my head down, living a life so small and careful that nothing could hurt me. And you know what? I was miserable. I was empty. I went through the motions every single day and felt nothing. She took a step closer to him, close enough to see the conflict warring in his dark eyes. These past 2 weeks, I've been terrified. I've been exhausted and stressed and completely out of my depth. But I've also felt more alive than I have since before Marco died. Because I mattered. Because what I did made a difference. Because when I held Isabella and Julia, when I helped you heal, when we sat together in the dark and shared pieces of ourselves, I felt like I finally found what I'd been looking for without even knowing I was looking. Enza. Federico's voice was hoarse. I don't want your money, she said, pressing the crumpled check back into his hand. I don't want to forget this happened. I don't want to go back to my safe, small life. I want this. The impossible, dangerous, terrifying this. I want you and Isabella and Julia. I want to be part of this family you're building, even if it means risk, even if it means I can never go back to who I was. You're asking me to be selfish, Federico said, but his resolve was cracking. To risk your life for my happiness. I'm asking you to let me choose my own life, Enza corrected. To trust that I know what I'm doing, what I want. I saved your life in that alley, Federico. Let me save my own by choosing to live it instead of just surviving it. Outside, headlights swept across the windows. The car had arrived. Federico looked at Enza, then at his daughters, then back at Enza. The weight of the decision was written across his face. The war between what he wanted and what he thought was right. If you come with us, he said slowly, there's no going back. Your old life, it's over. You'll be tied to me, to this family, for as long as you choose to stay. In the world I come from, it doesn't forgive or forget. Are you absolutely certain? Enza thought of Marco one last time, of the guilt she'd carried for not being there when he needed her. Of all the chances she hadn't taken, the risks she'd avoided, the life she'd let pass her by while she played it safe. I'm certain, she said. Federico's control finally shattered. He closed the distance between them in one stride, his hands cupping her face, and kissed her like a man who'd been drowning and had finally found air. Enza melted into him, her hands fisting in his jacket, kissing him back with 2 weeks of denied want and newfound certainty. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Federico rested his forehead against hers. You're absolutely insane, he murmured. Probably, Enza agreed. But I'm your kind of insane. A car horn honked outside, impatient. Federico pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. Last chance to change your mind. Not a chance, Enza said. We're a family now, so let's go home. Together, they gathered the twins and their belongings. Together, they walked out of the cabin and into the waiting car. And together, they drove toward a future that would be dangerous and complicated and nothing like the safe life Enza had planned. But will be hers, chosen, not settled for. And that made all the difference. The drive north took 3 hours through winding roads that grew progressively more isolated. Luca was behind the wheel, a man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and watchful eyes that kept flicking to the rearview mirror. He hadn't said much when Enza climbed into the car alongside Federico and the twins, just nodded once as if her presence required no explanation. In the back seat, Enza held Julia while Federico cradled Isabella. Their free hands were intertwined between them, fingers laced together like they'd been doing this for years instead of minutes. Every few miles, Federico would squeeze her hand as if confirming she was real, that she was really here, that she hadn't changed her mind. She squeezed back every time. The estate appeared as they crested a hill just after midnight. It sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a private road with a gate that required 3 separate codes to open. The house itself was beautiful in an understated way. Stone and timber construction that looked like it had grown from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Warm light glowed from the windows, welcoming despite the isolation. It's stunning, Enza breathed as they pulled up the circular drive. It's safe, Federico said, which seemed to be the higher compliment in his world. 15 acres, all of it monitored. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. No one knows about this place except the people in this car, and 2 others I trust with my life. Luca helped them unload, carrying in bags and supplies while Federico and Enza managed the twins. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Vaulted ceilings with exposed beams, a stone fireplace that dominated the main living area, furniture that looked expensive but comfortable. Someone had already stocked the kitchen and prepared 2 bedrooms, one clearly set up as a nursery with 2 cribs, changing tables, and every baby item imaginable. "The master suite is through there," Lucas said, gesturing down a hallway. "Nursery adjacent. I had my wife help with the setup. She said to call if you need anything." He turned to Enza, his expression softening slightly. "Welcome to the family, Ms. Costa. Federico's a lucky man." After Luca left, the house fell into peaceful silence, broken only by the twins' soft breathing. Federico and Enza stood in the nursery, having just settled both babies into their cribs, and looked at each other across the dim room. "This is real," Enza said softly. "We're really doing this." "Having second thoughts?" Federico asked, though there was vulnerability beneath the question. "Not even a little." Enza crossed to him, letting him pull her into his arms. "Just trying to process that my life changed so completely in 2 weeks." "Mine too," Federico murmured against her hair. "I thought I'd lost everything when Maria died. Thought the best I could hope for was keeping Isabella and Julia alive and safe. I never imagined." He paused, his arms tightening around her. "I never imagined feeling this again. Hope, happiness, the possibility of something beyond just survival." Enza tilted her head back to look at him. "I need you to know something. I'm not trying to replace Maria. I could never." "You're not replacing anyone," Federico said firmly. "Maria was my wife, the mother of my children, and I'll always love her. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and so are our daughters. You're not a replacement, Enza. You're a new beginning. For all of us." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Come on," Federico said, taking her hand. "Let me show you our room." "Our room." The words sent a warm flutter through Enza's chest. The days that followed found their own rhythm, different from the tense hiding of the cabin, but no less intimate. They woke with the twins, took turns with feedings and changes, learned how to be a family through trial and error, and a lot of sleepless nights. Federico proved surprisingly competent with diapers, though he drew the line at singing lullabies, claiming his voice would give the girls nightmares. Enza discovered she had a talent for getting both babies to sleep simultaneously, a skill Federico declared nothing short of miraculous. 3 weeks into their new life, Federico sat her down at the kitchen table with his laptop. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her. "About medical school, about the life you gave up. I made some calls." He turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was an acceptance letter from Columbia University's online medical program, specifically designed for students who needed flexibility. The letter was addressed to Enza Costa and dated that morning. "Federico, I can't afford." She started. "It's taken care of," he said. "Tuition, books, everything. And before you argue, this isn't charity. Isabella and Julia are going to need a doctor in the family, preferably one who won't ask questions about their father's frequent mysterious injuries." Enza laughed, even as tears pricked her eyes. "You got shot again and didn't tell me?" "Not yet," Federico said with a slight smile. "But statistically, it's probably going to happen. So I'm investing in my future health care." She pulled him into a kiss that said everything words couldn't quite capture. The medical program started the following month. Enza threw herself into it with a hunger she hadn't felt in years, studying during the twins' nap times, reviewing anatomy while rocking Julia to sleep, discussing case studies with Federico over dinner. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was actually paying attention, and Enza fell a little more in love with him every time he did. Federico had made changes to his own life as well. He'd handed day-to-day operations of the family business to Luca, maintaining only strategic oversight through secure video calls held in a locked office the twins would never enter. He made it clear to his organization that his priorities had shifted, that his daughters came first, and anyone who had a problem with that could find themselves unemployed or worse. "I'm not my father," he told Enza one night as they watched the twins sleep. "He died in his office at 70, still running everything, still fighting battles that didn't matter. I won't do that to Isabella and Julia. They'll know their father. They'll have my time, my attention, my presence. The business is just money now. They're my legacy. 6 months after that rainy night in the Brooklyn alley, Enza stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the master suite. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost from stress. Her skin had a healthy glow, and her eyes were bright with purpose. She barely recognized the exhausted, resigned woman she'd been. "You look happy," Federico said, appearing in the doorway with Julia on his hip, Isabella held against his chest. "I am happy," Enza said, turning to face them. Her family, impossible and unconventional and born from trauma and danger, but hers nonetheless. Terrifyingly happy. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? Federico asked, moving closer. "The best kind," Enza said. She took Isabella from him, settling the baby against her shoulder, and Federico adjusted Julia in his arms. Standing there together, the four of them reflected in the mirror, they looked like any other family. No one would know the violence that had brought them together, the danger that still lurked at the edges of their life. But they would know love. The twins would grow up surrounded by it, protected by it, shaped by it. "I got my midterm results today," Enza said. "Top of my class." "Of course you are," Federico said with obvious pride. "My brilliant doctor." "Not a doctor yet. Still have 3 more years." "You'll get there," he said with absolute certainty. "You're the most determined person I've ever met. When you commit to something, you don't quit." "I learned that from you," Enza said softly. "You could have given up 100 times. In that alley, in my apartment, in the cabin. But you didn't. You fought for them, for their future. That kind of strength, that's worth learning from." Federico kissed her temple, careful not to disturb the baby in her arms. "We make a good team." "The best," Enza agreed. That night, after the twins were asleep and the house was quiet, Federico and Enza sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets, watching stars they could actually see this far from the city. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. "Do you ever regret it?" Federico asked quietly. "Everything you gave up, your apartment, your job, the life you planned?" Enza thought about Rosie's diner, about the ghostly reflection she used to see in that window, about the woman who'd been going through the motions, surviving, but not really living. "Not for a second," she said. "That life was safe, but it was empty. This life is complicated and dangerous and nothing like what I imagined. But it's full. Every day matters. Every moment counts. I have purpose. I have family. I have you. How could I regret that? Even knowing what my world entails. The secrets, the violence, the fact that we'll always have to be careful. Even knowing all of that," Enza confirmed. She turned to look at him, this powerful, dangerous man who read bedtime stories with silly voices and learned to make bottles one-handed, so he could work and parent simultaneously. "You're not your world, Federico. You're the man who chose his daughters over his empire, who's learning to build something better than what he inherited. That's who you are to me." Federico pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the night sky and dreaming of the future they'd build together. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, threats, moments when the past came calling and demanded its due. But they'd face it together, this impossible family forged in blood and rain and stubborn, reckless hope. Inside, one of the twins started crying, and they both smiled. "My turn," Federico said, standing and pulling Enza up with him. "Our turn," she corrected, keeping his hand in hers as they walked back inside. Because that was what family meant. Not facing things alone, but facing them together. Not perfection, but presence. Not running from the past, but building something new from its ashes. Enza had gone looking for nothing but the bottom of a dumpster that rainy October night. Instead, she'd found everything she'd been missing without knowing she was missing it. A purpose beyond survival, a love beyond logic, a family beyond blood. She'd found home. And as she and Federico lifted their crying daughter from her crib, as they soothed and rocked and whispered nonsense words until the crying stopped and sleep returned, Enza knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Not the safe choice, not the easy choice, but the right one. The one that transformed a ghostly reflection in a diner window into a woman fully alive, fully present, fully herself. And that, Inza thought as she watched Federico dance slowly around the nursery with Isabella in his arms, humming the tune he claimed would give the girls nightmares, was worth every risk she'd taken. Worth everything.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.